Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. As Mariana mentioned, we have a lot to cover, so I'll be brief. First, we'll start off talking a little bit about the global assumptions and how that's expected to impact the region's growth, especially for 2024. And then once we kind of that baseline kind of established, we'll talk much more specifically about the consumer story. So we'll talk about how different purchasing power factors are expected to behave over the next 12 to 18 months. And then we'll really talk about pockets of opportunities across different retail categories among the top 6 markets. I will hold myself accountable this time around. We should have some time at the end for a brief Q&A section. So if there are any questions or comments that you have throughout the course of the webinar, feel free to just submit them in the chat box and we'll get to them as soon as we can.
All right, fantastic. So here you have my first question. Cecilia, we certainly know that pricing and demand forecasting have been more challenging than usual in recent years. So before we get into the specifics about the consumer landscape over the next year, what would you say are the key conclusions or ideas that our audience should take away from this session today?
Yeah, for sure. So just to help kind of I would say, help guide our story today, we definitely want to offer some of the main takeaways or the messages of this webinar. So first and foremost, I would say we're going to get into the numbers a little bit in a minute or so, but we do expect that the region will feel a little bit of moderation from a headline growth perspective in 2024, but we are forecasting greater consumer spending for the next calendar year, especially in markets in Chile, Colombia, and in Mexico. That's probably where you'll see consumer spending rebounding a little bit more strongly. So that should provide a little bit more upside for quite a few of these markets in the year to come. Ultimately, what are some of the factors that are going to play into this story? So I would say overall, the more positive view kind of leans very heavily on the fact that we are expecting to see lower inflation and credit costs for 2024, along the fact that we don't really expect major changes on the resilience of the labor market for quite a few of these markets. But one of the reasons why we don't see consumption rebounding even stronger is because we also have higher levels of household debt, as well as lower levels of savings to contend with over the next year or so. And then finally, to give you a little bit of a glimpse in terms of where we expect those pockets of opportunities to be concentrated, overall, it should be somewhat of a continuation of the dynamics that we've been seeing this year. So we still expect quite a bit of resilience in fast-moving consumer goods. Non-durables is probably where you'll probably be able to capture a bit more of the opportunity next year. And durables, while we expect a bit of an improvement from the trends that we've been seeing so far, are still kind of expected to lag behind some of these other categories that I mentioned. But Mariana, yeah, back to your original, I would say, the question or statement, we've definitely seen a little bit more challenge on the pricing and the demand planning side of things. And though today is a bit more focused on 2024, I think it would be helpful to get a better understanding into what kind of footing do we enter the next year in. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first polling question for the section to just get a better understanding of how 2023 has fared for our audience so far. So I think we can keep it open for a couple more seconds, and then I guess Mariana and I can offer some of our preliminary thoughts on what we make of the results. I think we can go ahead and close that out. Let's see what we got. Okay. So it feels like we're leaning a little bit more positive than we have more to the upside than it is to the downside. I would say that's somewhat consistent with what we've seen across our client base. Every time we do somewhat of these benchmarking results, it definitely seems that we're steering the ship in the right direction. Anything else jump out at you, Mariana?
I think I agree with you. It seems like the vast majority of the clients and prospects answering this call are either at or above the target. I think that makes a lot of sense given the dynamics that we've seen in the macro environment and how we've seen a lot of markets across LATAM outperform expectations, particularly in the consumer space.
For sure.
Fantastic. So let's dive into the global and regional growth story for 2024 to see if we can give a little bit more context as to why firms are seeing their performance evolve in the way that we're discussing so far. Seeing especially as this global and regional story is going to have a direct implication on how consumer spending dynamics are expected to behave next year, right? So Cecilia, we've seen some pretty important changes actually to our global and regional growth story for 2024. So could you walk us through what our latest thinking is for next year's outlook?
Yeah, for sure. I think definitely, as you mentioned, we've done some fine tuning on the growth side, both at the global and the regional level. So I guess let's start a little bit more at the higher level. What are expectations for global growth? You can see here that for next year, we're expecting to see a moderately better year relative to the one that we're forecasting for 2023. Our 2024 growth casts are slightly above 3%, which is pretty a significant revision from where we used to be and represents a bit of a improvement in the macroeconomic environment. I would say lower inflation and the fact that this will allow many major central banks to begin the process of cutting interest rates. Again, both aspects that really directly feed into the consumer spending story are probably some of the areas that are going to give us a little bit more breathing room. When we look at which, I would say, regions are expected to fare significantly better, Europe is one where we expect a lot of that upside to be concentrated. But I think it's also important to mention that for quite a few of the other markets that impacts LATAM, so for example, the US or China, we're still expecting to see a bit of a slowdown as we enter the second semester of the year, as well as into the early stages of 2023. So for the US specifically, we expect kind of the bottoming out of that economic activity to be a bit more concentrated in Q4, early Q1 of next year. So when we think, especially, for example, of export demands coming from our region, we'll probably feel a little bit of a slowdown specifically for that. And for China, we're starting to see that the preliminary figures, especially after reopening, have somewhat fallen short of our expectations so far. So we're expecting to see a little bit more weakness stemming from China's economy, especially in the second semester more than anything else. But so I would say across the board, even though 2024 is poised to be a better year, we're still now in the beginning stages of a bit of an economic slowdown. I would say that tends to be also that narrative tends to also be true for LATAM as a whole. We're starting to see certain markets like Mexico still post very, very strong growth figures, but for Brazil and I would say Peru, Chile, Colombia, we're starting to see the beginning phases of a slowdown that will carry us into 2024 as well. So ultimately, from a headline growth perspective, we don't expect much change between the figures we're seeing for 2023 and the ones for 2024. I would say definitely some of the major markets tend to go a little bit more on the lower growth side. So Brazil and Mexico are expected to feel a little bit of a slowdown, but you're definitely seeing other markets where there's quite a bit of opportunity, and a lot of that is going to be targeted or concentrated in the consumption story as well. Chile specifically is a market where we expect contractions this year. Next year, we're expecting to see quite a significant level of rebound, and I would say Colombia also fits that description as well. But if we were to boil down even deeper and talk specifically about the consumer spending side of things, you can see that, again, 2024, there's quite a bit of opportunity in terms of the forecast of consumer spending that we're projecting. So a little south of 2%, which compares to the very modest 1% that we're seeing this year. But I think what's always interesting is to compare that even though there's that opportunity to be captured, when you compare LATAM relative to some of the other emerging market regions, or really, frankly, the regions that we tend to compete with, especially for corporate investment, we're somewhat falling short of the growth expectations that those regions have.
Hi, my name is Krista Reganey, and I'm the Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.